Here is a short passage from a Beethoven piano sonata. This piece is a scherzo, not a fugue, of course, but it shows a very good example of a special kind of counterpoint called invertible counterpoint at the octave. Notice that the main theme starts out in the left hand, while the right hand plays a running eighth note accompaniment. Then, when the phrase is repeated, Beethoven puts the melody in the right hand, now doubled in octaves, and the same accompanying line now works as a bass line. This rearranging of the voices is what we mean by inversion. In this video, we're going to begin looking at different kinds of countersubjects that can be written in counterpoint against the fugue subject and answer. Invertibility at the octave is a very useful feature for a countersubject that is going to migrate throughout a polyphonic texture. I would say that fugues written with this kind of countersubject are probably the second most common kind of fugue, just behind the simple fugue that we went over in part 5 of this series. Almost all of my videos build on previous ones, so if you haven't seen that one, you definitely should. In that video, I showed 3 fugues composed by Fuchs using this subject. Fuchs also uses this subject to show how to compose countersubjects that are invertible at various intervals. This is the countersubject he composed that is invertible at the octave. We can construct a chart that shows how the harmonic intervals formed between the subject and countersubject change when the voices are inverted. This will look familiar to anyone who watched the video on how to compose invertible counterpoint, but I will go over it again here. Each interval will invert to its octave complement. In this chart, the perfect consonances are shown in green, the imperfect consonances are blue, and dissonant intervals are red. The key thing to notice is that perfect fifths will invert into dissonant fourths upon inversion, and vice versa. This means that we need to treat all of our perfect fifths not as perfect consonances, but as if they are voice-leading dissonances. The only perfect fifth that Fuchs employs is formed on the second quarter note of measure 2. This fifth is approached by step, but left by leap, and so at first this seems like it won't work. But this is an example of an idiomatic figure from the Renaissance known as a nota cambiata, and the resulting interval of a fourth, upon inversion, is correctly treated as a cambiata figure. More common than the cambiata would be to treat the perfect fifths as passing tones, neighbor tones, or suspensions, after which the fourths that result from inversion will also behave as correctly treated dissonances. Fuchs then composes a completed fugue using this subject and countersubject. In the next part of the video, I'm going to analyze a fugue that is composed in this way, so I won't analyze this fugue in any detail. But as we listen, pay attention to how the countersubject, written in blue note heads, migrates throughout the texture, sometimes above and sometimes below the subject or answer. Just like in the other video, red note heads indicate free, florid counterpoint. And notice how much less of it there is now that the voices can be occupied with different thematic material. Before moving on, there's an important point to be made here regarding the difference between tonal and real answers, and how they relate to a countersubject. Fuchs's fugue used a real answer, and so the countersubject could be easily transposed to fit with the answer. But what about a tonal answer, where the answer is not formed by an exact transposition of the fugue subject? How can a countersubject that works for the subject also work while accompanying a tonal answer? This is one of the questions that Franz Schubert brought to Simon Zector when they had their meeting in November of 1828, only a few weeks before Schubert died. Zector wrote out a very simple whole note subject that outlines a perfect fifth, and that requires a tonal answer that outlines a perfect fourth. See the video on subjects and answers if it isn't clear to you why this should be the case. Zector then wrote out a countersubject that works in invertible counterpoint at the octave. You can tell this at a glance, by the way, because it simply does not contain any perfect fifths. If we were to transpose this countersubject into the key of the dominant, we would get this. Notice that some of these intervals didn't show up on our chart from earlier, because they are larger than an octave. Technically speaking, this example is transposed at the 15th, 2 octaves, instead of an octave, since the bottom voice moved up a 12th and the top voice moved down a 4th. But this distinction is not often very important, and musicians still commonly refer to it as inversion at the octave. The problem occurs in the second measure, when the answer takes the note C instead of D. This probably sounds sort of okay to our modern ears, since the measure could be understood as a dominant 7th chord in the key of G. But in that case, the note C would be behaving as a chordal 7th that does not resolve down by step, which is a no-no in the strict style of counterpoint. Zector advises Schubert to adjust the countersubject like this, so that we get the same harmonic intervals between the two voices that would have occurred if the subject were real instead of tonal. That sounds like this. For the last part of the video, I want to analyze a fugue written with an invertible countersubject at the octave from real repertoire. Here is the fugue subject for "And with his stripes we are healed" from Handel's Messiah, not to be confused with Whip It by Devo. And here is Handel's countersubject. We can tell that the countersubject will work when inverted at the octave, or 2 octaves or 3, because the only fifth that occurs is this diminished fifth on the last quarter note of the third measure. Even if that interval had been a perfect fifth, it is approached and left by step in the same direction, so it would have worked as a passing tone. Here is Handel's answer, and the countersubject inverted to occur beneath it. Notice that Handel here uses a tonal answer, and he avoids the problems that this creates even more easily than Simon Zector. He simply waits until the second half of the subject before starting the countersubject. Here is the exposition of Handel's fugue. The voices enter in descending order: soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and so the countersubject is presented exclusively above the subject and answer. Handel uses short connecting material between each pair of entries. Some authors refer to this kind of material as episode, and others prefer not to call it an episode. They'll call it a codetta, link, or bridge. But whatever we choose to label it, we should try to understand why it is there. The answer ends on the note E flat and in the key of C minor. So we need some sort of connecting material in order to prepare the entrance of the subject back in the tonic key of F minor. After the bass entry in measure 19, Handel includes an extra soprano statement, which I've placed in parentheses. The soprano takes the answer here, since it already had a statement of the subject back at the beginning. This is exactly the process that would happen in a counter-exposition, although it seems strange to call this one solitary statement an entire counter-exposition. Ebenezer Prout speculates that the purpose of this extra entry is to provide an opportunity for the bass voice to have a chance to state the counter-subject within the first section of music, and to reveal how it works when inverted beneath the answer, and I find that persuasive. The middle entries are divided into two pairs of subject and answer, with episodes in between, just as we saw with Fuchs's 3 and 4 voice fugues in the video on simple fugue. After a short episode, the tenor states the subject in the subdominant key of B flat minor in measure 31, and the bass answers in F minor in measure 37. This answer looks identical to the main fugue subject. The answer had to take place in the dominant of the subdominant, which by coincidence is F minor. Another episode leads into the key of E flat major to prepare the statements of the upper voices. The alto states the subject in E flat in measure 48, and the soprano follows not with an answer, but with a statement of the subject in the key of A flat major in measure 55. This leads to an episode that confirms the key of A flat with a perfect authentic cadence in measure 63. The final section begins when Handel returns us to the global tonic of F minor, with a statement of the subject in the soprano in measure 63, and the bass voice answers in measure 67, all while accompanied by abbreviated statements of the countersubject in the other two voices. Next, we would expect two further statements in the tonic key to be given to the tenor and alto, but instead of a short linking passage, we get a relatively lengthy episode that leads us back into the key of A flat major, and another cadence there in measure 79. The soprano and bass then reverse the process from the beginning of the section, with the soprano taking the answer and the bass getting the subject. The inner voices, they had their chance. Now all they get are two statements of the countersubject to accompany the outer voices. This leads into the final cadence of the piece, a half cadence on C as the dominant of F, which prepares a pregnant pause before the beginning of the next piece. In the next video, we will be looking at some of the rarer types of countersubjects and how they are used in designing and composing a fugue. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments section, and please do like and subscribe if you want to stay up to date with the upcoming videos in the series.